right? And so we're going to talk about the power of Black sexual liberation in arts, and the ways in which that the media that we see, the visuals that we see, even the way that we embody like our own empowerment and move in our own agency, is an extension of art, right? In its own way. So I'm so excited to talk to y'all about this. So yes, I'm gonna kick it off the first slide. Yes. So yeah, let's start off with like a history, right? Like we know that when we're talking about Black sexual liberation, like of course, like we think of the body, like that is actually the first place that we start. We talk about our relationship to ourselves and how other people make us feel, and even how we engage each other in relationships. um, the other things that we also should recognize, right, is the landscape of the world that we live in that creates the ways that our relationships function, right? The relationship with our own personal body and other people's. So where I like to start always is actually the cultural citations of anti-Blackness. So it kind of feels a little heavy, right? Because you're like, what does this have to do with my body? But it has so much to do with it, because actually the ground of how we think of white supremacy, how we think about oppression, how we think about the hierarchies of desire, how we see colorism, fat phobia, ableism, and even the ways in which that we see that transcribed through transphobia and queerphobia. So much of that is deeply rooted, not just in white supremacy, but actually anti-Blackness, the foundation that Blackness should be hunted, should be othered, and then therefore everybody else is punished because of it. So I love to start with Sarah Bartman, who is also known as Hottenot Venus. She was a Khoikhoi woman who was objectified. She was actually put into a freak show, right? She was actually put on display for white folks to actually stare at her, to watch her, because her body was so grotesque to them. So a lot of the depictions that we see of Sarah Bartman are actual, like true exaggerations. Sarah was actually really only 4'11". She was actually very petite, but she had a very large behind to whiteness, right? But we can see from these pictures that it looks like she's taller than everyone. She's clearly darker than everyone. She has this very extended butt, right? And it's not to say that there aren't Black people who actually embody these types of features, right? But it is actually to say that these exaggerations are super rooted in the white gaze. Like the ways in which that non-Black people actually see Black people is always as monstrous, is always as other. It is a very particular fascination that works to always put Blackness on display, and always to make it seem that Blackness is actually always in opposition, or is always moving in consumption or gluttony. And so when we're looking at Sarah Bartman, the violence that happened to her is so much of a reflection of what we see in our world now. I know that there's often people who actually believe that using Sarah Bartman as an example is what should actually push us towards respectability, but it actually isn't. Sarah's story is so important for not to actually move towards respectability, but to actually witness and intervene how anti-Blackness demands that we are always being seen as somebody else's property. And so it's really important that we actually move towards a narrative of agency, right? Not actually that we should perform this type of purity, or like trying to respond to white supremacy by trying to withhold the ways in which we want to be fully expressive, but that we should actually acknowledge that no matter how we show up, whiteness will always position us in a particular way that doesn't allow us full agency or consent over our bodies. So yes, next slide, please. So I love to talk about Margaret Garner. She's actually my OG feminist. I don't want to put that on her, right? Because I also really want to be clear that like I really love honoring that people's stories are theirs, and I don't necessarily think that people's traumas necessarily need to inspire, right? Like because the violence that Black people have suffered historically is absolutely atrocious. And so what I want to name is with Margaret Garner, though, like it is the demand of the intervention of agency in a world that actually forces you into contradiction. I think is such an important lesson. And it's so interesting because I know people may not actually see the connections here, but I can't wait to make it. So Margaret Garner's story is this. This particular picture that was painted of her is about her story and how her child was about to be sold to slavery. And she couldn't stop it, because in colonization, you actually had no control over yourself. You had no control over your children. You had no control over your family, your circumstances, anything. And so, in order to intervene that in her child being sold away from her, she killed her child, which we would actually name as infanticide. infanticide. And in doing this, right, this was about being forced into a contradiction that nobody would ever want to be in, right? No one wants to be put in the position where you're thinking, either I lose my child forever to a world that I know will beat them, harm them, rob them of their agency, or I take them out of this world because if it's me versus the world, then I'm going to choose me, right? I'm going to choose my child. And I think that that moment, this like Margaret's story is so important to name again the landscapes of anti-Blackness and white supremacy works to put us in these contradictions to have to choose things that we wouldn't do otherwise. And so what I really want to ground this in is the fact that if we're living in a world that doesn't actually grant us autonomy to our bodies because of how anti-Blackness works, because of how colonization has shaped our world, what does it mean to actually intervene that by trying to create our own reclamation and our own empowerment in our own bodies, and also how we create boundaries for ourselves? So I really love referencing Margaret's story because it also invites us into the narrative that all agency and autonomy around our body isn't always specific to sexual, right? Like it is also just about just the very nature of having consent over your own circumstance, consent over your own choices, having consent in a culture and an environment that allows you to be able to care for your child holistically and not feel like you were going to lose your child against your own will, against your own better judgment for what would actually be okay for them. So I really wanted to invite us into this to ground us again in how anti-Blackness operates, to really frame the fact that autonomy is a large conversation that is deeply in contradiction with how colonization has demanded that we don't have any. So yes, next slide. And also too, if I need to slow down, please like put it in the chat because I know I'll be talking fast sometimes, but I really want people to be able to have time to talk and discuss and make it really interactive. So I know this is a big jump, right? We're going from Margaret Garner and Sarah Bartman to WAP, but it makes sense, right? So I feel like, look, WAP was really a hit. She was really that girl. She really was. She did her thing. She came. She really snatched our wigs. And so what I love about WAP was that it was actually such a disruption. It was actually cataclysmic, right? Like so much to the world around us. People had such visceral responses to a song, right? Because we know that WAP stands for wet ass pussy. What does it mean to actually be in conversation with Black women who are in their own agency and own autonomy to name that they not only are honoring, you know, their own bodies, right, but are actually having a dialogue and a conversation about their pleasure? And what does it mean to actually be in control of your own pleasure in a world that actually says that only men are allowed to do that, that only certain people of certain races are allowed to do that, and that if you were too audacious with your claims for autonomy, if you are too audacious with your sexuality, then we must punish you or we must silence you. And so we actually saw so much of that because the responses were that literally that the song itself or that Cardi herself and that Megan herself were actually now detrimental to the world. There were people who were saying you were not a role model to children, you were actually detriments to the society around us, and you should be ashamed of yourself for ever thinking that you could talk about your pussy on a song, let alone talk about how wet it is, let alone talk about that you want to fuck people, right? That you want to be in your bag, that you want to be out in these streets and do your thing. Like, why would you? So it's like we see that people have these very particular responses because people want to have control, right? They want to silence what is too free because this feels in opposition to what the world demands of us. That actually we do embody respectability, that we do embody purity, right? We are always caught between the whore and the virgin dichotomy that anti-Blackness gives us, that white supremacy tropes for us, right? And so either way, though, we know that even when you are, even though we know virginity is a construct, even if you are on like, I don't want to have sex, if you're reserved, if you just are in your bag and your consent and you just don't want to make that choice, right? Even if like, you know, you're fully dressed, if you don't look like Cardi and Megan, if you're not singing about your genitals, you are still punished by the same ways of how misogyny operates, right? We know that gender violence actually works to punish anyone, even if you follow the quote unquote rules. So even when you play the game, you still losing because the game is already rigged. And so that's what happened with Cardi and Megan. So what I really love about WAP and what I like really want to invite people to really think about with WAP is that that this is actually a really different landscape that we're seeing. We're in a different time where music actually is in more control over, like, well, not everybody, right? But Cardi actually has a lot of control over her stage and her access to be able to cultivate the landscape of her music. Every artist doesn't have that. So I love that she not only reclaims the stage to determine body autonomy, but she's also able to be in control over the visuals of how. Hey. I heard somebody say my name and I was like, hello. But yes. So all that to say that she was able to reclaim the stage. And I'm naming Cardi particularly because Megan was featured. So I really want to be clear because Cardi has a very particular level of access that I think most artists don't, specifically rappers, right? So she's reclaiming the stage to determine her own body autonomy.
I'm going to actually mute all Hunter and then
If you give us a moment, we are handling any disturbances. If anything, all this proves is that the work that is being done is needed. If someone feels the need to disrupt this space, they wouldn't be talking about it unless we're talking something worthwhile. Hunter, are you good?
I'm good.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for that coordination. So yeah, so I think what's really important is this is the difference between exploitation and empowerment, right? Because Cardi actually has control over her stage, like in a very particular way that most people don't, because we know that music execs, we know that folks who are often who are supporting artists in production, even just the landscape of who gets to work around you is often not in control of the artist. And so, so much of what happened with WAP, with the video production, with the lyricism, with the rollout, was actually Cardi and Megan's collaboration and idea to be able to push that. That often does change the relationship to who is actually able to embody this particular sexual liberatory agency, because everyone can't do that. There are a lot of people who were exploited in music, and Little Kim was one of them, right? We know that like historically, Little Kim actually like reflects a lot on the ways in which her relationship to other rappers or even her label often put her in contradiction, where even though what she was doing was empowerment, right, was always in this narrative and always in conversation with exploitation. And then also too, we know that this happens to other artists or who are actually pushed into only having a particular type of presentation, like in how they offer their work and their art. So WAP is not only was not only just like important and a great song, right? It was also an intervention for anti-Black misogyny, because again, it was a reclamation. We know that like songs like Throat Baby, we know like Future's Rich Sex, we also know like Cameron, Suck It or Not, like songs like this, like people like often really connect to and are not giving the same type of feedback that WAP received at all, right? It's like, oh, well, men are allowed to do what they want. They're always allowed to talk about their genitals. They're always allowed to talk about the sex that they want to have. But when women are doing it, particularly Black women are doing it, it's a very different narrative. It's also a very particular expectation and a muling that happens, right? Because I really want to harp back on like this expectation that Cardi is supposed to be a role model. And so why? Why is Cardi like supposed to owe anybody anything? Why can't Cardi just talk about her own pussy and live her life? Right? Like I just, it's the demand that Black women be in service at all time, right? It's the demand that Black women always are mules for everybody else. Like, you know, you have to be, you are now the failure for why the Black community cannot thrive, because you decided to talk about your own genitals and your own pleasure. So like no one is actually saying that to Black men in the capacity of rap, where they're literally saying you were the reason for the failures of the entire community. It is often like a different relationship where people are saying like, thank you for all the honesty that you offer in your music. Thank you for all the expansiveness that you offer, from sex to your story of growing up, your hood hero narrative, or like even what you navigated around substance usage, or how you are a writer and like Black men are actually in this capacity, right? Because I want to be clear, not in the grand scheme of white supremacy, but in this capacity in comparison to how Black women are treated, are actually given more free range in their artistry to be able to be more versatile, right? To talk about whatever they want and not actually really suffer a particular punishment for it or be expected to save everybody. But the expectation for Cardi and Megan was, why aren't you saving us instead of talking about your pussy? Like, huh? Like, so all that to say that that's such an intervention for a world that demands a particular type of performance from Cardi, from Megan. But I do want to invite us into the fact that who is able to reclaim their autonomy though? We know that actually everybody is not given the same opportunity that Cardi and Megan had on the song, or even in their own lives, to be able to reclaim their sexual agency without a particular type of punishment. So I do want to say that even in how we talk about respectability politics, sometimes respectability politics, when we're trying to embody them, it is often for survival, and sometimes it is often because we are taught that that is like the way that we are supposed to be. But I want to name that there is a particular type of freedom and access. Like, there's an intersection of freedom and access that everybody doesn't get the chance to, because there are punishments, right? So for Cardi and Megan, it was the critiques, but for other people on the street, it may be assault, right? It may actually be getting your ass beat, right? It may be people punishing you in your relationships and not wanting to be engaged with you because you were too much in your autonomy. And so there are particular cultural and social punishments that come with living in your wholeness, living in your autonomy, living in your freedom in your body, while you're navigating the intersections of Blackness and gender oppression. So yes, next slide. So yeah, I want to invite us into what Black sexual liberation is. So it's the thing that we deserve. We all deserve this. Yay, us. And so I think what's really important about Black sexual liberation is the fact that, again, it centers not necessarily on you having sex, right? Really want to be clear about that. It's not about the acts that you do. It is really about the agency and the autonomy to determine what you want to do, right? What feels good for you, to determine your boundaries and how you want to engage yourself and other people in relationship. And so it's also about sexual exploration, not feeling like you have to be limited to a particular idea of cis heteronormativity, right? Everybody's not straight. Everybody is not straight. Yay, us. Because I know we know this, right? Everybody's not straight and everybody is not cisgender, right? And so those of us who are also experiencing gender outside of cisness, beyond cisness, who are beyond the binary, who are trans, we are at an intersection too, like where often we are erased from narratives around sexual exploration, because it often does, even when we get that part of the conversation, even when we look at like historical Black feminisms, we are often overrun with the narratives around cis womanhood in a very particular way that does kind of like limit the conversation. Now we know that there's mad queer studies moving, so I really want to shout folks out for that. But I do also want to like name that there is a particular cis heteronormativity that sometimes really does dominate that. When we're talking about rap, it is dominated by cis heteronormativity, because we are often talking about straight Black men versus straight Black women. And then the songs are often centering each other, right? Like, and so, but we know that it's possible that they could be talking about other people. We also know that there are people who aren't necessarily out, right? Who could be talking about gender expansive politics in their work. I think that there's like some Young Thug lyrics where I'd be like, I feel like you talk about non-binary folks. I really do. But like, but I can't put my finger on it just yet because you got some politics to work out. But it's like, so sometimes like a lot of us find homes in these lyrics that sometimes don't have the explicit language that does hold us, but we find the sentiment and then we try to make a home out of it. And even still, that's not really fair. But we do know that there's mad queer rappers. Shout out to Cakes to Killa, shout out to Big Frida. And so I think that, we should actually push for more conversations around queerness in these conversations. So I do also want to say that with Black sexual liberation, it is also too about the freedom of having experience, right? I think that the expectation, like I'm going to use Cardi as another example, right? with the critique that she received around WAP, I think what's also really important is like there were particular narratives around, well, like this experimentation, like you should be doing this if you are a wife, and you shouldn't be doing anything else, right? So it's not just the expectation of what you're supposed to be doing in your relationship to a man, or what you're like the demand of the gender performance that you must do as a woman, but it also too is the piece that you're not allowed to experience anything outside of that. You're not allowed to have any type of freedom and to do something and be like, oh, I don't really know if I like that, but cool. I'm just going to go back to the things that I do like. Right. Like, it's like, are you allowed to do that? So we know that, like, when, I don't know if folks saw the WAP performance at the Grammys, but I know lots of folks had lots of feelings because they were like, these people are scissoring on TV and I can't believe you're doing this in front of kids. And so again, it's like this idea that so that what they were doing was something that was again stigmatized to what the performance and the expectations of their bodies and their personhood was. And I mean, so what if they do want to scissor? Like, okay. And even though like what I saw was really just, a quick bump, I like turned into a very particular type of like sexualized act that everybody really was like, this is something that you shouldn't do as a straight Black woman. Again, like we're all on a spectrum of how we want to experience things. We're allowed to do things in our performances, even if they're not things that we would do in our personal, relationships. We're also allowed to do things in our personal relationships that we decide later we don't want to do. And so I just really want to say that that's also another piece of Black sexual liberation as well. Um, and so to wrap that up before we move into the exploration of hoism even further, I do want to again name that like the cultural love language of the world that we live in is truly anti-Black gender violence, because we are indoctrinated with this idea that there's a normalization of the fact that cis heteronormativity should be the default, right? That we should be moving towards respectability politics and that hoes should be punished, right? That we actually shouldn't be uplifting people having sex with who they want to when they want to, right? It's like, people who want to clock you for your body count, people who want to tell you that you are supposed to only do certain things if you want to be a wife, if you want to be partnered. All of those things play into this like narrative around against consent. And really, the thing that we're fighting for the most with Black sexual liberation and really Black liberation in general is not just the destruction of anti-Blackness and the violence against everybody, therefore, who lives in this world globally, but the very fact that like consent is the key and the grounding to the world that we do want to live in. That we actually should be able to self-determine how we want to be with ourselves, how we want to explore, how we want to identify, and how we want to be with other people. So yes. Next slide. So yes, so we know, like I said, anti-Blackness low-key my favorite word. Like I like I know a lot of people use white supremacy, but anti-Blackness is actually where I cite everything. And I know everyone doesn't have the same framework, but it's really true. And so because it is the soil to our society and our relationships, it's also really important just so that we can like invite a narrative around desirability politics. And so, like I said at the beginning, right, everyone doesn't actually have the same entry point into these experiences. We actually know that people who experience colorism, people who experience fat phobia, people who experience ableism, queer phobia and transphobia, and gender oppression are often positioned in a different level, in a limited level of access to being able to have control and agency over their bodies. But also, too, are also punished by desire, where we actually don't see everybody the same. The way that Cardi and Megan are able to thrive in their careers so much relies upon colorism and fat phobia in order for that to operate, right? Like the reasons why they're also able to do that is because of the ways in which that they are positioned while other people are othered or not centralized. Suki Han is a great example of someone who I do think is a fantastic rapper and actually deserves way more flowers than she gets, right? Even along with like Cupcake, even along with Tierra Whack, like there's so many people, right, who don't have the same level of access or visibility. And there also is a particular demand of a particular type of sexual sexualization of Black women rappers that like everybody can't have access to. So what does that look like when we hold intention Chica, right? Who's a fantastic rapper who can spit like no other, but is also too seen as not the feminine expectation that people want, not the sexualized expectation that people want. And so in turn, it means that there's a particular othering that happens that is not just rooted in colorism and fat phobia, but is also rooted in the fact that we will not listen or value your music if we do not want to fuck you. If there is no opportunity for us to create a relationship with your body where therefore you are now in service to us, we are still going to punish you and other you. And so I think that that is also too that something that we have to hold in tension, because as we are still trying to reclaim our own agency and autonomy to our body, we still have to recognize that the landscape of how anti-Blackness and hierarchies of desire work also still positions us against our own developed interest, our own self-identification as well. And so when we are in proximity to other people, it's really important that we remember that even still we can have a particular level of privilege slash violence over other people. And I really want to position privilege as violence, right? Because like when like, so I say that to say, because sometimes when we say privilege, it lands in a particular way where it's like, well, just recognize that you have privilege, but it's like, but don't just recognize that it is a privilege. Recognize the fact that your privilege is rooted in somebody else's death, right? So let's actually reframe it to actually your privilege is violence, right? So like, and it's not something that you can necessarily have control of. The second that you're in the room, right? If we put Cardi and Suki Hana in the room against whatever they decide is like internally, the world will already position them in a particular way against each other. Will already other Suki Hana for being dark skinned, right? Will already other Suki in a particular way too, because she's not the same type of hoe as Cardi, because Cardi might be like a refined hoe who was just a stripper, right? But Suki got an OnlyFans. Is it the same? It's not. And so we're also looking at the landscape of how anti-Blackness positions us against each other. And so both are just as important. So yes, next slide. And so reclamation of language, honey. So like, I mean, for real, who we calling a hoe? Well, we're not calling nobody a hoe because, you know, unless you want to be called a hoe, but everybody has the right to determine if you want to be a hoe, if you want to be called a hoe. Everyone has their own agency to do that, right? And so I do want to name that hoism is a facet of Black feminism. It is, to me, it is like just, it's intricate to the foundation of what Black feminism is. Some people would argue against that, and today is not the day. But I think that it is. And it's because it specifically does advocate for the sexual agency and bodily autonomy of yourself, right? And so it's also a personal political identifier, like I said. And so anyone can be a hoe. Anyone, and that's across the gender spectrum. Anybody can be a hoe, and it is up to you to determine that. Hoe is not. I think that it's also really important to destigmatize what wholeness is, while also holding the tension of the spectrum of wholeness. It's so much work, right? Because it's like, oh, okay, like we can personally identify as hoe. That should just be it, right? But also the other part is that some people are seen as hoes before they ever identify as hoe. And so how do we actually hold that? How is that also influenced by desire? How is that also influenced by anti-Blackness? And so the ways in which that people might cling to respectability just for the very fact that their bodies are already positioned as hoes. I think a really great example of that is the difference between how Chloe Bailey is treated versus her sister Hallie. Chloe is treated in a very particular way where like people have already over sexualized her in a very predatory way, in a very punishing way, because of the shape of her body, right? Compared to Hallie, who is thinner, doesn't have as like a particular defined shape of hips, right? There's an expectation that I think people really have of certain bodies and who we see as like sexual just because of their shape. And I think that that difference is really important, because what we see is that Chloe has not defined for herself out loud to us how she wants to be identified, how she wants to move in her sexuality, if she has even come to that conclusion, if she's even being sexual, right? Because putting on clothes don't make you sexual. Putting on clothes don't make you a hoe, right? Like, so it's like people are giving and putting and positioning that onto her, projecting that onto her. That in and of itself is misogyny, right? Like that is a particular type of violence where we have now stripped Chloe from her own agency, from her own story, even from her own motives of why she does what she does in her body, and have determined that it is seemingly because she is on some sexual revolutionary narrative. And it's like, who has determined this for her? Like, she has not told us this. So let's not project this onto her. And so, yeah, I do want to name that so much of hoism is also an intervention in a way to really like look at the possibilities in the landscape of what you can do in your individual exploration and your identity around your body and your boundaries. So yes, I do want to, yep. Yes, sorry. Thank you. I was just reading the bottom. I was like, yes. Okay. So in ungendering hoe and talking about hoe, like for all of us, right, across the gender spectrum, I think it's really important to just like be clear that, like I said, wholeness can be embodied by anybody. You can be a hoe. It is up to you. It is up to your consent. Again, I do want to hold intention that some people are already like, we're all treated in a particular way where we are all punished by misogyny. And so therefore, in so many ways, we're already punished for what wholeness is supposed to anoint for us, right? So it's like, even if you don't self-identify as a hoe, you will still be punished like you are a hoe. That's because that dichotomy, like I said, between the whore and the virgin, it's an unwinnable game. The game is rigged, right? So even when we actually determine for ourselves how we want to identify, what actually feels good for us, what our pleasure politic is, how we will create boundaries and continue to set our own rules and determine for ourselves how we want to be in our body, the world too will still punish us at every given turn, no matter how we actually do it. So I really want to implore everyone here that like on your journey and how you identify for yourself, it is so important that you actually determine what feels great for you, right? Because the world is going to punish you regardless of what you choose. So make it make sense for you. Build a home within yourself, build a home within the words that you use to hold yourself, and choose your pleasure always. So yes, next slide. And so in shifting to a culture of consent, right? Because that's where we want to go. In this Black sexual liberation reality, right? When we're talking about art, when we're talking about the ways in which that media, music, visuals, all of these things really play into how we're actually like shifting our relationship to ourselves, and also witnessing how the world does treat people who are in these depictions of art. I think it's really important for us to also recognize that so many of these opportunities are also for us to shift to a culture of consent, which would recognize how anti-Blackness already shapes the landscape and the relationship to our bodies and each other, but also to invite us into a praxis of possibility to be able to normalize consent practices, and also to honor our own personal boundaries and determine them for ourselves. I really love I don't know if folks remember when Black China and Amber Rose were really on this hoes be winning kick. They had this whole like spiel. I thought it was so fire. Because at the time, like they were kind of low-key the most hated in terms of like visibility of like the Instagram hoes, like slash video hoes, like because at the time their relationships with very famous men, Kanye West and Tyga, were being severed, and they were being positioned as like bitter baby moms. Oh, it wasn't Kanye, it was Wiz Khalifa for Amber. And so at that time, right, they were seen as like these bitter baby moms who were basically left for other women. And so even still, then the position became like, is your wholeness enough to actually keep like the people that you're with, right? Because there's a new hoe who comes in and then takes your partner. And so I thought it was such an interesting position, because what it did was it not only still reasserted that Black China and Amber were hoes for losing their men, right? And being hoes before their men, apparently, but then also to still being like old hoes after losing their men to new hoes. So again, like I said, right, you could be like there was no determiner if like the new partners of their ex-partners were actually really hoes, but it was really just the fact that, again, it didn't matter what side you were on, whether you became the new person in their ex-partners lives or whether you were Black China and Amber, you were still being punished, you were still being seen as a hoe. And so for them, they reclaimed it and they wore it like right on their dresses to the VMAs, I believe. Oh no, it was iHeartRadio music, I believe. And so when they did that, I thought it was such a great cultural moment because they were wearing the very art that I think is so important, right? So when we talk about art, again, it's an expansiveness, it's how you embody it, it's also to what you wear. It's the paintings that we look at, it's the music that we listen to. And they literally actually wore art that affirmed like their self-identification and standing in the face of misogyny to say, F this, like we are hoes, and now what? Like we are gold diggers, now what? And so as we move towards a culture of consent, what does it mean to again stand in the face of gender violence, anti-blackness, and misogyny to name that you are actually going to choose for yourself how you identify? You're going to choose for yourself that it actually doesn't matter what anybody says about me. And that's not the same for everybody, but I think in their case, right, they're naming that, fuck what all these people are saying. I'm actually going to stand in how I see myself and I know my own value. And so being a hoe doesn't diminish me because it's really just me choosing what I want. So how do we actually move towards that? So we will do the next slide. And so in wrapping up, I really want to hear folks' assessment of this. I'm so happy. I feel like we did good on time so that we can hear people talking popcorn. But I do really want to like hear about how people want to create boundaries for healthier relationships. And so some of the questions that I asked was how can we create consent culture in our lives? What boundaries are necessary for you to feel safe and affirmed? And how can we intervene in people and ideologies that violate our boundaries, right? And so of course, all of this is within the context of anti-Blackness, but I think it's also really important that we contextualize it in the sense that we are talking about how this world puts us in a position to contradict ourselves when we choose ourselves and also to when we need to survive, and how sometimes we often have to shapeshift to reflect that. So I would love to hear people's thoughts, and I hope that folks really enjoyed how all the pieces came together around the art and Black sexual liberation. Yay!
Yay. So just in efforts to protect this space, we are going to ask that if you want to speak, please raise your hand.